पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर् द्यौः शान्तिर् दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर् वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर् नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We begin today on verse number 10 on page 295. Tesham satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam dadami buddhi yogam tam Yena mam upayanti te. To those who are thus ever devoted to me and worship me with love, I give that yoga of understanding by which they come unto me. So in the earlier two verses we saw to which people this verse is referring to. I am the source of all, everything is produced out of me, knowing thus the wise worship me with devotion, with their mind and senses directed to me, explaining me to each other, and talking of me, they are always pleased and happy. So those amongst us who are not only convinced intellectually that the divine being, there is a divine source to everything that exists, that everything that we see and feel has come out of that one source, and there is this spontaneous flow of love and adoration towards that source. When that happens, when our whole life gets filled with the thought and presence and love of the divine, then such people, as verse 9 says, with their mind and senses directed to the divine, whenever they speak with each other, they relate with each other, it's all filled with the presence of divine. And it is to such people that in this verse he says, to these people who are thus devoted to me, by me is meant the divine source, and worship me with love, I give that yoga of understanding. The Sanskrit word here is Buddhi Yoga, the yoga of Buddhi, by which people, once they acquire this yoga of understanding, they then reach the divine. Now, this much thought has been given to this phrase, Buddhi Yoga. The word Buddhi often gets translated as intellect. But here, when Krishna speaks about Buddhi, well, say we already have a Buddhi. So what is this yoga of Buddhi that Krishna is giving? It is true. We already have Buddhi. But if that Buddhi is locked, if we do not have access to our own Buddhi, then it is as bad as not having it. It's a little bit like, let's say, if all of your data is stored and made secure with a password, and you have forgotten the password. But all your data is with you, but you have no access to it because you don't have the password. Now, that's a kind of a crude analogy. We already have all the buddhi within us, all the understanding within us. we don't have the password. And so when we fulfill certain conditions, Krishna will give us the password. That's the idea. So there are ways of entering, awakening, or tapping into that infinite source within us, that power of intuition. I would like to say something more about intuition. It is this. As I've mentioned on earlier occasions, in the traditional forms of education, the Vedic education, whenever the student went to the teacher's home in ancient times, before beginning any study, the first prayer that the student was taught was the Gayatri prayer. Nowadays also, in many Orthodox families, there is a ceremony at certain stage by which they call it the thread ceremony, and ceremonially the Gayatri mantra is given. But by and large, in the times in which we live, this has remained like ceremony, and it may not have entered as deeply into our educational life as it did originally in ancient times. Because the purpose of the Gayatri mantra is to awaken that power of understanding. In fact, all true education really begins after that power of understanding awakens. In fact, that the last part of that Gayatri mantra, Dhiyo Yonaf Prachodayat, that Dhi is really this higher form of buddhi. So what clearly, even without undergoing that, we have some buddhi. Everyone says we have an intellect. But what the Gita is pointing out, that we probably have access to maybe just 1% of the infinite, really, power of understanding which is already within us. So with this 1% access to our own buddhi, our normal day-to-day activities and work can go on quite all right. Just 1% of that buddhi is enough. Most people live happily all through their life with that 1% access to their buddhi and don't even notice, don't even know that there is such a big fund already available to them, but they don't have access to. Perchance, if some people, through practice of self-discipline, through concentration, may acquire a little bit more access to that buddhi. And I've heard it said that if you can open up your buddhi even to say 4 or 5%, you will be considered a genius in this world. You might get a Nobel Prize. But even that 5% of buddhi is not enough for us to realize God. We need a total access to the buddhi. And that is why the Gayatri prayer was, awaken this power of understanding. Let that power of understanding guide me. So it is through a goal-oriented, disciplined life, focused on an ideal, that we are able to open up that buddhi. In other words, what Krishna said, once we, from a spiritual standpoint, we become aware that all of this manifested universe has come from one source, and whole of our life is directed towards knowing that source, not merely intellectually, but there is this whole being is drawn towards it, because after all, that's the one source from which we have come, and that's the one source we are going to go to. So it makes sense that if that's where we are heading, to know something about it, rather than kind of going into a tunnel and not knowing where we are heading. So these phrases in this verse, to those who are thus ever devoted to me, thus is referring to the earlier two verses, and worship me with love, not worship me out of compulsion. Oh, you got to study this. There is no compulsion there. So naturally, spontaneously, we are drawn to that, and to such people, then through Krishna's grace, we get this Bhakti Yoga. And once this Buddhi awakens in our heart, whenever you study any text, then the deeper meaning of the text becomes available to us. Right now, with our present opening of Buddhi, of course, now there is an English translation with the copies that you have. If you understand English, you will, of course, understand what this verse means. But let us never delude ourselves into thinking that what we have understood is, well, I know what it means. Well, maybe not. Maybe I know just one layer of what it means. But when my Buddhi opens up, I'll be able to dive deeper and deeper. So it's not just reading between the lines, but also reading what is far deeper in the depths of those lines to see the deeper meanings of these verses. And that will come through opening of the Buddhi. Not just that, then when we begin to pray, then we will no longer be praying to, let me put it this way. Our prayers will become more real, more tangible. Prayers will become a conversation with the divine in a more real sense. Our meditation will become more real as well. Our meditation then will involve less of imagination in the heart and more of perception in the heart. We no longer have to imagine there is a divine being sitting in the heart. We just have to then just look and see the divine in the heart. All of these things happen when this Buddhi in its full force is awakened within us. And it is through Krishna's grace, through the grace of the divine, that Buddhi will be opened. And with that opening of the Buddhi, we will then realize God. That's what he continues in verse number 11. Teshamevanukampartham aham ajnanajam tamaha nashayami atmabhavastho Jnana Deepena Bhaswata. Just to bless them, I, residing in their intellect, destroy the darkness born of ignorance by the resplendent light of knowledge. Teshameva anukampartham. Anukampa. Just to bless them. In other words, the opening of the Buddhi, the awakening of the Buddhi is an act of grace. What is possible for us to do is to fire on all cylinders, so to speak, just to put our best foot forward. That's the extent of self-effort. Give the best shot, do the best you can without holding anything back. And then once we do it, and when it's done with faith, with devotion, with love, it is then that as an act of grace, in some mysterious way, this awakening occurs in the heart. And that is, as he says, that the darkness born of ignorance is completely removed by the resplendent light of knowledge. Residing in the intellect, Atma Bhavastha. Atma here, although it's translated as intellect, it really refers to the heart. So it's not an intellect as a cognitive process. It's the heart, the spiritual heart. That's why we meditate on God, we meditate on our Ishta as sitting in the heart, because that is the seat, that is the place where it's most easy and natural to locate the divine. Although in reality the divine pervades everything, but it is in the heart that we first locate the presence of God. And it is dwelling there that as an act of grace, with the light of knowledge, the darkness of ignorance from our heart is removed. When Krishna mentioned this to Arjuna, this is what Arjuna says. The next few verses are the natural response of a devotee when this kind of a revelation occurs through the grace of God. Arjuna Vacha Param Brahma Param Dhama Pavitram Paramam Bhavan Purusham Shashvatam Divyam Adidevamajam Vibhum Ahustvam Rishayas Sarve Devarshir Naradas Tatha Asito Devalo Vyasaha Swayam Chaiva Pravishime. Arjuna said, "You are the Supreme Brahman, the Supreme Abode, and extremely holy. All sages, the divine sage Narada, as also Asita, Devala, and Vyasa, call you the eternal, resplendent being, the primeval deity, birthless and omnipresent, and you too are telling me so." So overwhelmed by the teaching that he gets from Krishna, this revelation that he gets from Krishna, this is what Arjuna says. You are Supreme Brahman. Brahman, as we see, as we know, is that infinite reality. The Supreme Abode. Param Dhama. Abode is where we take shelter. If there is storm, if there is rain, we need in a place which will protect us from that storm and rain. So the one abode from which we get shelter from all of the worries and problems that we experience in life is the divine being. All of the sages, they call you eternal, no beginning, no end, resplendent with the light of consciousness, the primeval deity who is beyond, he is the God of gods. Whatever higher beings that we can conceive of, the Supreme Being is higher than all of them. Birthless, because that which has birth has death. So that which has a beginning will have an end. God has no beginning and therefore no end. Omnipresent, not divided into past, present, and future. He is always there. We divide time into past, present, and future. So we know that we did not exist when we visualize ourselves in this human form. We see that in the past, before we were born, we didn't exist. In the future, after our death, we will not exist as these human beings. But the divine being, who is not bound by these divisions into past, present, and future, is always present. So Arjuna says, the past sages of the past have mentioned things about you, and you yourself are now telling me this. I agree with everything. I completely accept it. I don't have any doubts. Verse 14. Sarvame tat ritam manye yanmam vadasi keshavam nahite bhagavan vyaktim vidur devana danavaha. All this and what else you say unto me, O Keshava, I regard as true. O Lord, verily, neither the gods nor the demons know your manifestations. In the second verse of this chapter, this is exactly what Krishna has said. Neither the gods nor the great sages know my birth, for I am the cause of the gods and the great sages. And so here Arjuna is kind of reaffirming it. Yes, I completely agree that no one in this universe truly understands you. Whatever you have said to me, I completely accept. A great disciple and friend of Swami Vivekananda was this very fiery American woman named Josephine MacLeod. So she heard Swamiji first when she was 45 years old, when Swami Vivekananda was giving a lecture in New York. And then later, years later, in her reminiscences, she said, when she went to attend the lecture, she had no idea who this person was. And she said, the very first sentence he said, it struck in my heart, this is true. Then the second sentence he said, this is true. And then she said, throughout my life, whatever he said, every time my heart spontaneously responded, said, this makes sense, this is true, this is true. And that's what is the case of Arjuna here. He says, everything, Krishna, that you have told me so far, I regard as true. So we can see that sometimes in life. Whenever we hear something, and there are certain things that we hear, there's an immediate response. You may not exactly say anything, you may be completely silent, but deep in your heart, you feel like, yeah, this makes sense. Or it could be the other way. Sometimes something may be put in a very eloquent manner, might seem very logical, but still your heart says, no, I don't think it makes sense. So, and what Arjuna is saying here is, Krishna, whatever you have said, it makes sense. Though Arjuna does keep on asking him questions. You say this, you say that. So it doesn't always make complete sense to him. But what Krishna has said at this point about the people who are eligible for Bhakti Yoga, Arjuna says, this makes complete sense to me. About your nature, I have no doubt whatsoever. Verse 15. Swayameva atmanatmanam vetatvam purushottama bhuta bhavana bhutesha deva deva jagatpate. You alone know yourself by yourself, O best of persons, O creator of beings, O Lord of beings, O God of gods, O Lord of the universe. Now this is the natural and spontaneous way a devotee, when you are face to face with the divine presence, no words are enough to express the love, the love, the respect, everything that you feel. Sometimes you will see that we are so much overwhelmed by things that we try to express, you are this, you are that, and that's really what is happening to Arjuna here. And what he's saying is this, O divine being, since no one really understands your true nature, you alone know who you are. No one other than you knows exactly who you are. And then he will then, later on, the succeeding verses will say, since you alone know who you are, please tell us, please tell me who you really are, because if all these great gods and sages are incapable of knowing you, what to speak of me? So you please describe to me who you really are. Verse 16. Vaktumarhasya sheshena divya yatma vibhutayah yabhir vibhutibhir lokan imam stvam vyapya tishtasi. Verily, you alone can fully tell about your divine glories, through which, pervading all these worlds, you exist. So you alone can mention, you alone can describe how you are manifested, because how God is in God's own nature may be beyond our knowing right now. But at least let us begin by seeing how God manifests, because holding on to these manifestations, it might be easier for us to get closer to God. Again, a somewhat crude example. Let's say that there is a very well-known architect, famous architect, and you would like to go and meet that architect, but it's very difficult to get an appointment. And so we said, well, what do I do? You'll have to wait for a couple of years even before you get a chance to meet that architect. But while one day you will meet that architect, why don't you go and see some of the things this architect has designed? So you will have some idea about the way this architect thinks. So then you go and watch some of the buildings, the concert halls, and whatever these architect has designed, and then you looking at that, you kind of then wonder how because you see, it's a little bit like this. All authentic works, creative works, whether it's of architect or of sculptors or writers, poets, musicians, if these are authentic works of creation, by authentic I mean truly creative, then something of the artist will be present in that creative product. Because every product of creation is like a baby. It's like when parents can see something of themselves into their children. So just as we are able to see our reflection in some form, either due to some physical characteristics or some mental characteristics, something, and then we can say, oh, this is just like his mother or just like her father. So we are able to see at least a little bit. Our children may not be exactly identical like us, but we are able to see something of our children, something of ourselves in our children. In the same way, for all artists, for all works of art, for all, by art I'm just using the word art in a very broad sense, whether it's music, poetry, writing, everything. The artist will be reflected. Some part of the artist will be reflected in the art that is created. So if it's difficult to meet with the artist right away, we can get to know a little bit of that artist through that art. So that is really what Krishna is going to offer us in this chapter. This is what Arjuna is asking, that, oh Krishna, the divine being, only the divine knows who the divine is. None of us really know you in your true nature. But can you at least tell us how you manifest in this world? Because this world is accessible to us. This is tangible. This is what our senses can perceive. The divine being is beyond the senses, beyond speech. And one day we will be able to grasp the spirit as spirit. But right now, in our present level of understanding, it might be easier for us to grasp the glory of the divine through this manifested world. And that's what Arjuna is asking. You please tell me, Krishna, how you manifest in this world. What are your vibhutis? Vibhuti, if you go to the root meaning of the term vibhuti, means manifestations in different forms. Vividha bhavanam, that's how it comes, vibhuti, if you go to the root meaning. So how many different forms you manifest? And by holding on to these tangible forms, it will be easier for us to go to that intangible being. And as I've said, that's essentially what most spiritual practices are. We hold on to what is visible, what is tangible, and through that, taking a support of that, we go towards the intangible. It's like, let's say, if there is some great treasure, far away, kept somewhere far away, and you don't know how to reach there. But you are given a kind of a chain in hand. And then it is said, well, you don't know the way to reach there, but this chain will lead you there. Just hold on. Now, the chain is something you can see, you can hold, you can feel. You hold on to that chain, And link by link by link, you keep on going, and ultimately it will take you to that great treasure. Although the treasure itself, you may not be able to see now. It's too far, it's too subtle. What we can see is this little chain, and with that chain we go. The spiritual practice, this is what the spiritual practice can be. When you meditate, when you do japa, when you receive a mantra from the Guru, when you receive the object of meditation, so the form of the deity, the form of the Ishta, the sound of the mantra. Now, a sound is something that we are familiar with. Form is something that we are familiar with. It's more tangible. We are familiar with forms, so it's not too difficult to visualize another one form. It's not easy, but it's not difficult. It's not impossible because we know how to deal with forms. We deal with sound all the time. So the sound of the mantra is a tangible something. The form of the Ishta is a tangible something. So holding on to the sound of the mantra and the form of the Ishta, link by link by link, with a daily regular practice with love, devotion and faith, it is this then that will lead us towards that divine being who is really beyond all sound and beyond all form. So we take the help of form to reach the state beyond form. We take the help of sound to reach the state beyond sound. We take the help of words. The mantra is composed of words, but we take the help of those words to go to a state which is beyond speech, beyond words. So we take the help of the tangible, the visible, in order to go and reach the invisible, the intangible. And that is what this chapter is leading to. That right now, Krishna, I need to understand how you manifest in this world. So holding on to these manifestations, I'll be able to, it'll be easier for me then to know your true nature. Verse 16. Vaktumarhasya sheshena divyayatma vibhutayah yabhir vibhutibhir lokan imam stvam vyapya tishtasi. Verily, you alone can fully tell about your divine glories through which pervading all these worlds you exist. So you alone can tell me about these divine glories, the divine manifestations. Verse 17. Katham vidyamaham yogim tvam sada parichintayan keshu keshu cha bhaveshu chintyosi bhagavan maya. In what ways, always thinking of you, O yogin, can I know you? In which particular objects are you to be meditated upon by me? So as you can see, he's asking for something more tangible, which will help him understand the true nature of the divine being. Verse 18. Vistarena atmano yogam vibhutincha janardana bhuyaf kathaya triptirhi shrunuvato nasti me mritam. O Janardana, tell me once more in detail about your powers and glories, for I am not satiated by listening to your nectar-like words. He's saying once more because in earlier verses, it's not as if Krishna has not spoken about how the divine being manifests. But he says, I am not satiated by listening to your nectar-like words. When we love someone, we don't ever want them to stop talking. And of course, when we hate someone, it's just the opposite. But because here, of course, the divine being, Krishna himself is speaking, and Arjuna probably is a little worried. What if this discourse stops and I have to now go to this unpleasant task of the war? So if I can prolong this discussion a little bit more, I'm kidding. What Arjuna is saying is that although you have explained this to me, I would like to hear about it once again, and a vistarena, and in a little bit more detail. You have referred to it earlier in briefly, but I would like to hear this more in detail because I love hearing your words so much. I can never say, all right, enough for today. I can never say that. And that's really the power of the divine. It's never enough. And so now Krishna responds. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Hantate Kathayishyami Divya Yatma Vibhutayah Pradhanyatav Kuru Sreshtha Nastyanto Vistarasya Me. The Blessed Lord said, all right, I shall tell you about my principal divine glories, O best of the Kurus, Arjuna, for there is no end to the details of my glories. So to the question, tell me about your manifestations. Well, there are infinite manifestations. So then this discourse will never end. Actually, that one would have been one way of solving the problem. This discourse could have gone on and on. All the assembled soldiers would have just grown old and died, and there would have been no war. I wish they had thought of this. So what Krishna is saying here is that there is no limit to how much details can you go to. It's a little bit like, speaking of details, one of our Swamis was such a great scholar way back in the 50s. His name was Swami Tyagananda. And a story is told that he used to give a weekly class on the Gita, exactly the same text that we are studying. And as you know, the very first verse of this book begins with Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre, the word Dharma. And because he was so knowledgeable, there was so much to share, just explaining the first word of the first verse of the 700 verses book. The first word itself took 6 months. And so many people began wondering, we are not going to finish this book in our lifetime. And so really, there is no limit to how much detail we can go to. Literally, I mean, we are going in a pretty good speed here on this class. Because otherwise, a lot of these terms, there is so much involved. And it's good. We don't have to go into all this detail now, because that's where this Buddhi Yoga comes in. So don't ever think that because you have attended this class, that, okay, now I know what it is. This is just an entry into this great text. So then when you study this on your own, and a repeated study, to keep on reading it, depending on how much of your own buddhi is opening up, you will see deeper and deeper meanings into it. So no one can finish the Gita ever. Only when you become enlightened, when you realize God, then you can say, well, I don't need the Gita anymore. Until that time, all of these great texts, we can never say I have finished it. And therefore, what we are doing now is in just an entry, just putting one little toe inside this whole big palace, the Gita palace. And how much more inside you can go, enter into it fully. But that will depend on your personal practice, your personal efforts, and a personal discipline. The more you do it, the more of the meaning will be revealed to us. And that is what Krishna is saying. There is infinite of my manifestations exist, but right now I will mention only a few important ones. And we will take a look at one of these on verse 20, and then we stop. Ahamatma Gudakesha Sarvabhuta Shayasthitaha Ahamadishcha Madhyancha Bhutanamanta Evacha. I am, O Gudakesha, the self residing in the minds of all creatures. I am the beginning, the middle, and also the end of beings. Now, although the word mind is used, what is really meant is the spiritual heart. So I am the self. So the first, the most obvious, and yet the manifestation that most eludes us is our own self. There's nothing closer to us than the Atma, because we are the Atma. I mean, what could be closer to me than me? But sometimes when things are too close, they don't show up in our radar. As they say, things are very close, you don't see it. You see, for instance, sometimes if you can never see what's on your forehead. You might be able to see its reflection. But actually, if something is so close to your eyes, but you can't see it, because that's not where we just can't see it. And so, well, this is just one example. But the idea is that sometimes things might be so close to us that we may not be able to see it. And the Atma, our own self, is really, to say it's close to us, it really wouldn't make sense, because the Atma is us. And so Krishna is pointing out the first obvious manifestation of the divine is our own self. I'm the beginning, the middle, and also the end of being. So this being, this coming into being, every being comes, it's the Atma that is responsible for the beginning, the middle, and the end. Without the Atma, nothing, there would be nothing. And so we come from God, we dwell in God, we go back to God. And then in the subsequent verses, Krishna will give more examples of his manifestations. So do you have any comments, questions, thoughts about what we have seen so far? Yeah.
So Swamiji, I think a challenge for many of us is when we leave this class, we're re-immersed in our own lives, and we may lose context and continuity. So I'm curious, in the Gita, was this one continuous discourse between Arjuna and Sri Krishna? And if so, did Arjuna retain any of this knowledge afterwards? Do we have evidence that he actually learned something?
Okay, good question. Now, when you speak about discourse, I mean, the Gita is 700 verses. No matter how fast you read it, probably it's at least going to take an hour, probably a little bit more. It's difficult to imagine that this is actually a kind of a lecture that Krishna gave Arjuna. You can see the Gita scenario. All the thousands of soldiers on both sides. It wasn't like the war of nowadays. You just sit in some closed room with a computer, and with a drone you go and put bombs. It was just, they were all face to face, thousands of soldiers. And then the beginning of the war had already been initiated, with the conches being blown from both sides. And then when it's about to begin, and then Arjuna says, "Oh, I don't think I want to fight." Now, it seems a little bit difficult from our present a time frame to imagine that when they have all gotten ready for war, suddenly this discourse starts, and for 1 hour they are all waiting. Now, okay, when will this finish? Maybe go and have a cup of coffee and say, "Oh, is it over yet?" No, it's still going on. So it's doubtful whether the Gita exactly as it is written, was, first of all, I mean, you could say, well, who was there standing near and taking all notes? I mean, there wasn't, who was taping the whole thing? You are now doing streaming here, but there was no live streaming of the Gita discourse. And so what seems more likely to me is that, yes, this doubt did come into Arjuna's mind, and he would have said, Arjuna, oh, I can't fight. And then it's possible that Krishna, in a very few words, gave him the essence of this teaching. But such is the power of the divine that within those few words, he was able to impart a lot more insight than you and I can do or understand in those few words. So the insight that was given to Arjuna was a lot more than the extent of the words that composed it. And then Vyasa, much later, this great enlightened sage, was able to visualize that what transpired between Krishna and Arjuna, and then he then elaborated in words in this, what's the Gita right now. To some extent, this is how the conversations of Sri Ramakrishna came. The book, the Gospel of Ramakrishna, again, it was not, the conversations were not taped. One of the devotees, whose name was Mahendranath Gupta, who became known as M, he would carefully listen to all those conversations, then go home immediately or go out of the room, not in the presence of everyone. He had a diary, it was a very good, so we see the benefits of keeping a journal. So he had this personal diary, and he would immediately note down in points what are the topics that were discussed, what are the phrases he used. So just for his own mental reference, not a detailed verbatim report. Then he would go home and with the help of those points, he would then relive all the things that occurred, and that's how this longer version came. More or less, this is how the Gita came also. Although Vyasa wasn't present taking notes there, but because of a yogic power, he was able to relive what happened there and then put it in this form. So that's about the discourse itself. There is also, in the story of the Mahabharata, it is said that after the war was over, and of course the Kauravas, the bad guys, were vanquished, the good guys came to power, and Krishna said, okay, time for me to leave. Because that's how this whole Mahabharata story is. He appears on the scene whenever the Pandavas are in trouble. I mean, that's essentially how God functions. Whenever we are in trouble, we pray, and God's help comes, sometimes in very mysterious ways. And then when everything is fine, most people don't seem to need God when everything is fine. And so somehow God kind of seems to disappear for a while. So when the war ended with victory for the Pandavas, it was time for Krishna to leave. And it's that time that Arjuna then goes and says, oh, just before you go, just before the war was to begin, you told me something. But he said there was so much tension of the war. So at that time, he had faith in Krishna. At that time, the few words he heard from Krishna made sense to him. He says, as he'll say at the end of this book, my doubts are gone, I'm ready to my duty. And he does it. But later, in that calmer moments, then Arjuna said, I don't exactly remember everything that you told me. Could you please tell that to me again? And of course, Krishna wasn't like going with prepared notes. He's like, okay, I'll give you a link to my homepage. You can read all the discourse. It wasn't possible then. And so what Krishna says, I don't remember either. You asked me a question, and I gave you an answer which was appropriate to you then. I'm not going to be able to just exactly tell you what I told you then. But if you have any question now, you can ask me. And then Arjuna asks his question then, and then Krishna replies. And that Krishna's reply is this time much shorter than this 700 verse Gita. And that's actually another Gita. It's called Anu Gita. And Anu really means small, so it's like a small Gita. So Gita is really a genre. There are several. It's a Gita literature. So this Gita that we study, therefore, is called a Bhagavad Gita, and this is the most popular Gita. So if you simply say Gita, it's this Gita that is meant. But otherwise, there are many Gitas. There is Anu Gita, as I mentioned. In Ramayana, a teaching that Rama gives Lakshmana in forest, that is known as Rama Gita. In the Bhagavata, a teaching that Krishna gave to Uddhava is called Uddhava Gita. Then there is Devi Gita. There are many Gitas have come over the years. In fact, there is also a Ramakrishna Gita has been written. It hasn't become as popular a text, but the idea is that this Gita has become a class of literature in its own right. And so Arjuna may not have remembered every teaching, everything that Krishna told him, but there is something called a prajna samskara. When this higher teaching is given, it leaves an impression in the mind. So that subtle impression will help. So if and when Arjuna were to become so deeply enlightened, or when Arjuna's buddhi will open up, he will be able to recover what teaching he had received from Krishna. And that's the challenge for all of us. Sometimes when we read a text or hear some teaching, it may not make immediate sense to us. And it's so tempting to say, oh, this doesn't make sense. But sometimes if we are faith in the source from which that teaching came, we can hold it somewhere in the corner of our heart, even if it doesn't make any sense now. Because oftentimes it is seen later on, as we become more mature, as our own buddhi becomes awakened, then we look back, oh yes, I had read this 5 years ago, or I had heard this, but that time it made no sense to me. Now it makes sense. There are so many times in life it happens that way. Sometimes our own experiences that we have in life, the greater maturity that we acquire, the greater inner awakening that occurs, things that didn't make sense at one point make sense later on. And that's just how it is. Anything else? Yep.
At the start of today's lecture, you mentioned that those who are naturally inclined, I'm going to give Bhakti Yoga. But we seems to, at least, once we go back from here to the world, we are more inclined towards worldly activities than this. So, are we going to get Bhakti Yoga?
Yes, it will come. The thing is this, the more deeply we go into something, the more difficult it gets to come out of it. You see, it's like, as I said, for instance, just music, for instance. It's possible to have a kind of a interest in music. So there are times you listen to music, maybe make some music of your own, but it hasn't gone deep enough. So there are times when you may not even be thinking of music. But for some people, music can just become such a passion of their life that it's not that they are doing music all 24 hours. But music would have gone so deep into them that even when they are not consciously listening or practicing music, every sound will then remind them of some note or something or some tune. It's like any little suggestion from the external world is enough to take their mind to whatever it is that they are engaged in. And so when spiritual life becomes that important to us, when we go as deep into it, it doesn't mean that we won't be able to do anything else. We will do everything else. All our duties and responsibilities, everything will be there, and we will perhaps carry it out better than we were before. But what it means is this: even when we are engaged in what we see now as worldly things, even in the world, as we are carrying about our duties, there will be countless opportunities for us to be reminded of our spiritual life. And that's exactly the point of this whole verse. How does God manifest in the world around us? Because we are dealing with the world all the time. That is what we are engaged in all the time. So if I'm reminded of God only when I go to a place of worship, then when I leave the place of worship, I will have no point of contact with God. But on the other hand, if I recognize that God manifests in countless forms, in countless ways, even in things that I normally think as belong to the world, then I have hope. Because even when I'm dealing with them, then I will be able to see and remember the divine. So it's always like, see, when someone is in love, and then you know that your beloved, say, likes roses. And so when you are going to a market, you are not even thinking of your beloved, but then you see roses, but because of that power of association, then you think of your beloved because, oh, roses. So exactly in the same way, if we find things and objects and people and situations around us which will keep reminding us of the divine, then even when we are engaged in so-called secular activities, it will be possible for us not to lose touch with God. And that's the way to kind of remain immersed in the spirit, and that's when Buddhi Yoga will come. So first we'll have to make conscious efforts to find points of contact with our spiritual life, even when we are not ostensibly engaged in spiritual activities. It's easy to think of God when you are, say, come to a Vedanta center or go to a temple or study the Gita, when you're trying to meditate. Then we are doing something very visibly, very consciously connected with God. But what about times throughout our day when we are engaged in other activities, not particularly spiritual externally, our mind is thinking of everything else? Even in that, can I find ways to connect with God? That's the idea. And I mentioned sometimes as an example, creative ways. As I said, when you're driving and you come to a red light, you just have to stop. There is nothing you can do. You're just sitting in your car waiting for the light to turn. Now, can you then associate the red light with, say, well, that is the Lord looking at me? Again, you can do it, think about whichever way. Our support said, now, oftentimes, say, Sharda Devi, the mother, Holy Mother, she has this red dot on her forehead. And so every time you see a red light, you can say, oh, that's the dot on Mother's forehead. Now, that's one way, just one sample. So you're just looking at normally just a red light. But in your mind, if you can connect it, then you are automatically, every time you think red light, you're thinking of Mother. If you're thinking of Mother, you're thinking of spiritual life. Every time you sit near a window and there's plenty of sun now, there's sun rays coming in through the windows and sun rays fall on your hands. Nothing stops you if you have got a creative imagination in thinking, well, this is the shining hands of the Divine Mother or the Lord coming and saying, get up now, get to work. So whenever you see sun, you will have a way of remembering the divine. And so there is so much opportunity for us to use our imagination in creative ways that will help develop our spiritual life. And so it is possible to feel the presence of God even when you're doing other things. Otherwise, our life will get divided. There will be a wall saying, this is my spiritual thing, that's my worldly thing or secular thing. And a divided life cannot bring us satisfaction, cannot bring us fulfillment. Life has to be undivided, life has to be whole, life has to be holistic. And so we need to break the wall. And that's why a completely worldly person, a really materialistic person, has no problems. Because that person is materialistic everywhere. And that's great. I'm not saying that everyone should do that, but from some point of view, even for an undivided materialistic life, we'll have fewer tensions and worries. An undivided spiritual life, of course, is just filled with bliss. It's only those of us who are in the middle who kind of are interested in spiritual life, but there are also this secular thing. So we are like, where do I belong? I spend some time here, I spend some time there. So this wall that separates, that we have to find a way to demolish it and decide, what does my life taken as a whole, how do I want my life to look? Do I want my life to look as a worldly life, or do I want my life to look as a spiritual life? You cannot always have it both ways, like 50-50. Then it can't really bring complete satisfaction. It really becomes a source of tension at some point.
Maharaj, correct me if I'm wrong. Since I'm attending the Gita class, I find Gita is, although I'm learning from you, it's within me, because every character, whatever you explain, it's living within me. I have the Mahabharata character Gandhari, like I'm blind. Somewhere I do not understand. I don't see it. Even though I have a vision, I don't see it. I do have a jealousy. I do have a anger, like other side of, when they are fighting, other side of the brothers. And I do believe that Krishna is also within me, because conscious is always say that I'm doing wrong. So I find that Gita is within me. So if I really realize that, it's not I understand only, then I may live after class the same way how I'm in the class.
Sure, yeah. That would be a very good way to look at it. That's very good, very good. Okay, so we will stop here. When we begin next week, we'll begin with verse number 21. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu. We bow down to Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother. A topic on Sunday will be Holy Company. On next Wednesday, we will we'll continue with the study of the Gita, but next Wednesday will be the last Gita class we will have before we have a short summer recess. But we will meet next Wednesday at 7:30. On Tuesday and Saturday, our Arati and meditation will also continue as usual at 6 o'clock. So you're welcome for these programs. Conclude with a prayer now on page 3. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.